So if rationality is good, right, that morally good, and it can bring us to truth or reality, then what we need to do is apply rationality and all that means to the organization of human beings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. I can see why this is all very scary. I mean, I can see brown shirts marching back and forth in the background as you talk.
Okay. And so then the question is, okay, then what is rationality, guys? And it turns out that when that term has been, or that concept has been employed or deployed is really the word, in the modern era in Europe and America, it has meant scientific method, scientific management, engineering. It has meant reducing people to numbers, to bodies, making people and the apparatuses in a society into machines, making the world into a well-ordered society. These are phrases that might be, you might be remembering things. This might be bringing things to mind. So this is progressivism, right? This is what progressivism was. I mean, this is what they themselves said, and that's why we have city managers in this country now to this day. That's a progressive move, was to put, and these are actually engineers, people from, the sciences, who manage these cities. That was a great progressive measure. And so we also know we can figure out what is good and bad in the world by, applying scientific method. Now, so that's why we can just prove that Islam is inherently violent and produces jihad and 9/11. Because, well, you just look at the damn text and you can see, obviously, this is what it says. Read the text, and you read the text all together and you see it says, "Thou shalt take vengeance against the infidels." Well, that obviously just means 9/11. And because now that's Sam Harris, what I'm doing there, right? And that's his whole thing. And he has this amazing video in which he does this. And it's sort of like, well, one of the beliefs or assumptions in this rationality thing is that texts are transparent and that there is a single meaning, single true meaning in texts. And you just otherwise, right? Science doesn't work. It's irrelevant. Like, how do you determine what a text how can you prove with a scientific method, with rationality, what a text means? It's an incredible thought, right? How can you?
Well,
he believes.
I have an answer to one way. I think the best way to read a book if you're wanting to discover the truth of it. In other words, when you're wanting to figure out what it most likely means, and that is to give it a charitable reading, where what you're trying to do is steelman the arguments in it and make it as consistent and coherent as it can be. So you don't attribute absurd ideas to a text if other alternative interpretations are available. But what it also means is that someone might come along and say, look, this interpretation that you're giving to this text needs to be rethought because new evidence has appeared, and this makes even more sense of the text. So, then you would reinterpret it, and that's a perfectly legitimate move. So one thing about truth is, when it's human truth, is that it has got to be, if you're still searching for the truth, and that's important to realize that we don't always, okay, and we also shouldn't always seek the truth, But when you are seeking the truth, then you need to hold that your truth is open to revision, be charitable in your reading, and seek coherence and consistency and that kind of thing. And when I start to fall down, when I start to list all the things that makes for the most charitable reading that you can have, but it may take a little work to figure out what a text means, and you may not be able to come to a final conclusion in some cases, especially when you're very distant from the text in time. So, but yeah, that's how you read a text, and for truth. But there are other ways to read a text, like you want to read a text for the connotations, or for the connotations that are unique to you. And then that's more of a creative reading. But even then, there's a rationality at work in the way you are approaching the text.
That's right. Yeah. So this brings us to Foucault's protege, Derrida, right? Because, of course, as you know, Derrida says, I think, this is the way I read him, that a text can be read in infinite ways. And that, more importantly, what he says is, I think, that all languages are closed systems. So every word, every signifier within a language simply refers to another signifier. So if you look at a word in the dictionary, you'll see that the way the word is defined is using other words.
Yeah, it's really strange if you stop and think about that.
And then those words, they're defined, of course, by other words. And you keep looking at other words to define the previous word. And all you can do is you just keep going in these sort of circuits or endless circles within the system, right, of language. And so therefore what he's saying, I think he's saying, is that there is nothing outside of it. There's nothing external. There's no way to get closer to truth or objective reality through this system. It's all self-referencing. It all references itself. And so that's Sam Harris's problem. That's Noam Chomsky's problem. And that's, I think, rational humanism's problem, which is that it assumes that these things are portals or doorways or maps onto reality, that there's some direction. Hang on. Instead of just the map itself, and there's nothing outside of it. It's a game. I often use that analogy, like Monopoly or Sorry, right? It's like these guys, to me, rational humanists like that, are basically playing a board game, and they're really good at the board game, and they want everyone to play the board game well, but they don't know that there's a world outside the board game. They just think that the world is Sorry or Monopoly. And that's the problem. And they just want to insist that the people who are breaking the rules, who aren't playing fairly, need to play by the rules better and be better Monopoly players. And then we'll be living in utopia. And that is the true and good way to live. And you can prove it. They're right that you can use the internal logic and the internal language, the logos of the game. You can absolutely demonstrate that there is a good and bad way to play the game. And right. But they think that that's it. That's the whole world, and it applies to everyone. And it turns out that only like a handful of people are playing Monopoly, and most people are doing other things with their lives.
Okay, I'm going to do a little rhetorical response. And so I want to announce at the beginning that this is mostly a rhetorical response, because what you're talking about, to get to the bottom of it, really would take a whole podcast or two or three on its own. So look, Derrida didn't say that, like, Derrida was attacking structuralism. And he seemed to do a pretty good job of it. People seem to be convinced of his attacks on structuralism. I'm not so sure, but the structuralist perspective wasn't that we have direct access to the world through our language, or even that words represent objects in the world. That wasn't the structuralist position. The structuralist position was that there are words, which you might think of in terms of like syllables or sounds. You could think of them as the actual text. And then there are concepts, not objects, but concepts in the mind that are associated with the words. And that, in the structuralist point of perspective, what was significant was that they're not identical. Okay. Now, my understanding is that Derrida wanted to sweep away concepts altogether. And that's where, and just leave us only with the words. And to say that, that basically the concepts that we associate with words are arbitrarily associated. And, I don't necessarily think that it's arbitrary. I think it's rational, but open. And okay, so that's one, going way back in what you were saying. What I'm attributing to people I've never met and who may not even exist because I've never, been to China. What I'm attributing to them is not some way of life. It's not a set of principles. It's a very bare thing. It's that I'm attributing to them that they are stuck in a problem that's very much like my own, which is that I think and my thinking is empty and the world of appearances seems to be beyond me. Everything that I can say concretely about the world is not me. And yet I still think there's still a center and that I experience, but I experience it when I think and think and think and try to doubt everything. I experience it as a negation, as a sweeping away of all experience. And that's not, that kind of grounding is, it gives you a lot. It means that everything that you do in the world is somewhat unjustified, that you can't make a direct connection between, between your thoughts and the world, because the world is exactly what is not you. So the cogito, the Descartes' position, he tries immediately to find some secure mooring for after he gets to this revelation that all he can really know is that he thinks, therefore he is. And he has to go to like old ontological arguments for God and that kind of thing. Something outside the self to ground the self, because the self is empty. So, the point about Descartes is that he puts us in a position of unbearable responsibility. We have to try to be rational. We have to impose ourselves on the world. There's no escaping it. And yet, all that we can know for sure is that our thoughts aren't identical with the and that we're at a remove, and that we always have to be open to a revision. So if that's totalitarian, I don't know what.
Well, that's okay. So that's your reading of Descartes, which is maybe legitimate. I don't think there's any illegitimate reading of any text, since I'm a Derridian. But on that question,
it's not common. But Descartes himself, Cartesian duality and the Cartesian project and the scientific project, all of which, by the way, had lots of good things about them, but are also blamed for all the evils of the world at this point. And I think it's because we'd rather blame our own, life itself rather than blame capitalism for anything. The thing is with Descartes is that, yeah, he can be read other ways. And also he himself didn't remain at the level of the cogito. He went to God. Berkeley did a similar thing. Berkeley stripped away the world and then found something just like it, open to all the same problems that he had established were problems of the material reality, in order to moor himself. So we are unmoored. And that's the truth of our existence.
Okay. So now it sounds like to you Descartes is actually taking a subjectivist position.
Well, in a sense, but he's taking I wouldn't say subjectivist in so much as like he's denying that. Like, I think that the problem with subjectivist positions is that there's this almost tendency towards magical thinking. Like, all that matters is what you think. But the truth of what we know of the world is that the world is in opposition to us. The world is material. The world doesn't just bend to our will. We can't just think our way out of things. So I'm not a subjectivist. If by subjectivist you mean I think it's just all in our head, man. But what I mean is that the world is not directly accessible to us. That we are minded beings. That we're self-aware, and that gives us a very difficult responsibility. And that's what I mean.
Okay, so responsibility is a key word there. So how does your reading of Descartes inform your politics? How is this political to you?
To me, it gives me the challenge of recognizing that the world as we have constructed it is open to interpretation. That there's nothing fixed quite. in the world because we can see that the world is coming to us through the senses, and that it's ultimately that any structure you might want to impose on that is going to have to be open to revision. So that gives me the power to think about the structures I actually see and whether or not I'd want to revise them, and try to be someone who can radically revise the world. In other words, look at the deepest level of power that there is, which I think is the commodity form at the moment.
But you and Descartes both believe that there are more and less correct interpretations of the world.
Yes, I do. But I don't. But those are the way to judge that is, in terms of consistency, coherency, and maybe outcome.
Okay.
But we can't know the outcome ahead of time.
And for you, it sounds like what is most real and most important is this thing in capitalism called commodification.
Yes, that is what shapes our reality.
And so that's how that's the bridge you walk on from Cartesianism to Marxism. That's how you get one or the other.
That's my rhetorical bridge. I mean, to do it well, I'd have to step back and do some deeper thinking than I just exhibited, right?
Yeah.
But that's my rhetorical slippery bridge that I just built.
It makes sense. I mean, that just sounds to me like Marxism. I mean, because that's Marx. I mean, I believe he was a Cartesian in that way. I don't know if he ever wrote about this. I can't remember, but directly. But I think he would be, he would be happy with that interpretation of Descartes. Don't you?
I don't know, but it's always hard to tell with Marx. Let me put it to you this way. There's the bit of the pedant in Marxists I've found. So I would imagine Marx would be the king pedant. But in other words, like any interpretation you give would always be open to revision. I would be expecting a correction from Master Marx. But I think that I did an okay job.
Well, okay. What comes to mind immediately is one of the more controversial claims about Marx, which is his alleged theory of base superstructure, right? And so now there's I'm just saying there's a whole debate among Marxists about whether Marx really meant that. I think it's there. I don't think he spelled it out very clearly, but it's there. I mean, it's there in a few of his works. But underneath it all, right, it seems certainly clear to me that he believes that there is a material base to the world that is real and that is fundamental and that is the most important thing to understand. And it is the most important thing in determining the present and the future.
Right. But the important thing for Marx is it's a social reality.
But it's material in that it exists independent of human consciousness, though, right? That we can't just wish it away. We can't just, if we just have different thoughts, it'll still be there and it'll still be determinative. That's the point. It'll be determinative. So your class, you can believe if you're a CVS cashier, you can believe you're middle class, but that's not going to change your life. Your life will be largely determined, I think he would say, and most Marxists would say, largely determined by the economic material fact of your life, which is that you must work in order to survive, and that you happen to be born in a place, in a family that made it impossible for you to get a job that's better than CVS cashier jobs. So that, in other words, your material economic reality or base of your life determines who you are, what you are, and it largely determines your future. Now, he doesn't leave out the agency. There is agency, of course, in Marx. I mean, he does say that the working class sometimes makes mistakes. Sometimes they're not revolutionary when they should be, and sometimes they're revolutionary too soon. But ultimately, it's kind of like saying, well, at some point, the working class will choose to overthrow the capitalist structure and establish its own state. And now that is in some way kind of robbing the working class of agency, because he's saying that they are essentially determined by historical forces that are outside of them, which again is this kind of materialist, objectivist position, which now, right? And you can see,
I'm not sure that's true that Marx actually believes that. I mean, I do think that most Marxists believe that, like the economistic Marxists believe that, and I tend to lean towards the economism, but I don't believe that there's anything that I do believe that it will take agency on the part of the proletariat and creativity on the deep creativity on the part of the proletariat in order to really create a revolution. And the fact that the Soviet Union was such a failure points to how easily you can delude yourself into thinking that you've gone the distance when you haven't. So I would say there's nothing in Marx's economic theory that points to the economy itself automatically leading the proletariat to create something else. But they're just the best bet because they have nothing to lose but their chains, basically. That's, again, rhetorical flourish, but that's the argument.
Capitalism sows the seeds of its own destruction. I mean, it's inevitable that capitalism will collapse, right?
I don't know where that's really quote comes from off the top of my head, but in crisis theory, capital sows the seeds of its own destruction, and its own destruction is always what brings it back into full force. It's basically boom or bust. Booms, busts, booms. The destruction of capital. It's like the phoenix rising from the ashes. The destruction doesn't kill capitalism. It is a part of capitalism.
Yeah. Well, so there's a few problems, right? Since Marx wrote that Marxists have been dealing with. One you mentioned, which is the Soviet Union, actually existing communism, the stuff that claimed to be Marxism in the real world, in real regimes, in real countries, and all that. Which Marxists mostly now say, oh, well, that's not really Marxism. And okay, I get it. Those were in peasant agrarian societies. They're not the societies that Marx predicted would become socialist. He would have said that was premature, et cetera. Okay, fine. Then there's the fact that I think there are bigger problems for Marxism historically in the last 100 or so years. One is that, as a matter of fact, the working class has not become immiserated, that the working class has become enriched by capitalism, that the working class today is far, 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 far wealthier than it was 100 years ago, that it's far wealthier today than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, that if you look at a chart of capitalist development, it is straight up. It goes straight up in terms of production, distribution of wealth, distribution of goods, material enrichment, across the board, across the world, in every country in the world has had some capitalist development. And in every part of the world, the working class, the poorest people are richer now because of it. So that's a real big problem. And then the third thing, and this really comes back to Foucault.
This is the one I think that we should focus on, because the other two,
yep.
I feel like I can dispense with them, maybe not rhetorically easily, but I think I can dispense with both those. But the third one I want to hear. Go ahead.
Okay. Right. That's just a debate. That's an empirical question, right? Whether it's actually material enrichment.
Okay. Let me answer the first two quickly. The first one that you said was real existing Marxism. And yeah, you can see that, it went wrong. But you can also ask the question, to what degree did they actually, stick by any kind of Marxist analysis of the economy? And in the Soviet Union, it's clear that they abandoned the primary aim of Marxism, which was to transform the mode of production, or to get rid of wage labor, to restructure society at the base. That never happened. They basically kind of believe that first, before we can do that we have to compete with the bourgeoisie and create our own state-centered bourgeois projects, and organize labor around the very same aims of value production. I mean, they talked about it. They wrote about it. So there's that. So they abandoned the core Marxist ambition, which is to transform how we produce things, not just who owns the factories. The second thing is, what was the second? Oh, the fact that everyone's getting richer. I never do. I like people. Steven Pinker, is the guy's name who wrote a book about this? Yeah. So the reaction people on the left have had to him seems to me just miserable. Like, because he's saying, yeah, capitalism has created an abundance of wealth in the world. And if you're a Marxist, you're not going to deny that. He's like, yeah, of course it has. The problem with capitalism isn't that it doesn't produce immense amounts of wealth. It's not even that it doesn't distribute it well. Because, if you read the Critique of Gotha program, by its own principles, it's completely just in the way it distributes goods. The problem is that the way we produce things, one, always leads to crisis, and two, means that we're always in the service of this abstraction and not in the service of humanity. So we could do better. It's not that that this is the worst system ever in history. It's not that it hasn't done tremendous good in terms of empowering humanity. It has. It just means there's another step and also, when you're talking about everyone being richer, the other thing is that the immiseration in Marx wasn't about literal starvation, although he probably had visions of that because, he was seeing it. But also, it was more like abstractly, it was of the process of exploitation, which he was describing, which that hasn't changed. And the more, and it is just a fact that the more successful capitalism is, the more exploitation is going on.
Yeah, and so as for my third point, and that's the bridge there. Your use of the term exploitation, that category, which we talked about when you're on my podcast, right? And I don't think I quite said this to you on the podcast, but now's my chance. Here's, I think, the biggest problem of all for Marxists these days is that the working class, generally speaking, has not thought of itself as being exploited. They have not thought of capitalism as exploitative. They haven't thought of their bosses and employers as exploiters. Some of them have, most certainly, but I think it would be hard to maintain the argument that most or even a really substantial or significant portion of the working class in the most developed capitalist countries have thought about their own lives, their own work, their own jobs, their own economic position in the way that you do, the way that Marxists do.
I didn't think of it until I read Marx. I mean, it's not like something that's going to come along and just come to you. And the idea that the proletariat are just naturally Marxist is ridiculous. First of all, I'm not talking again about material wealth. You can be hyper exploited and living in relative luxury. The exploitation isn't on the level of physical wealth. It's on the level of abstract value, which we're in the service of, but which, try to track it down. It's not in any object. So and the other weird thing is to kind of illustrate this, you can have a factory which is producing 1 million, let's say, plush pillows. So you have, a tremendous amount of wealth in plush pillows, but the value of those pillows can be really, really low. In fact, lower than fewer pillows 10 years earlier. So what you're talking about when you're talking about exploitation is not physical wealth. You're talking about an abstraction, which is produced only in this capitalist economy and which we don't need. It's a rule of the game that, we're in the service of, but that we don't actually need to keep using to determine how we produce the world. And I know I'm just talking a lot of Marxist lingo here, but I actually believe what I'm, this stuff I'm spewing. So
yeah, well, so it's the labor theory of value is the bottom of this, and so the idea is that you work in a car factory, you make a car, and that the capitalist sells the car for a whole bunch of money, and he takes most of that money and you take very little of it in the form of your wage. And your point is that there is more that is owed, right, to the worker than he gets.
No, that's not even the point. See, that's the thing that's so confusing. It's like there is economic value that the worker created that he does not get. Is that right? That's right. That he doesn't control.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. But if you paid him what he was worth, you go out of business. It's not like he's being cheated. Okay. The relationship is set up like you're not, the weird thing is you're not even paying him for what he produces. You're paying him to come to work. You're buying his time, and his time is worth whatever the set of commodities are that he thinks he needs to get through the day and come back again. It's like a, you're not buying him. You're paying for his stuff. Right. And his stuff is going to, if the stuff he wants is less than the value he produces, you can't afford him. That's it. And it's not about a matter of being cheated. It's a matter of being exploited.
So do you believe that 100% of the economic value is created by labor?
I believe that 100% of the value is created by labor, but that profits are huge sectors are profitable without creating any value at all.
I should say the workers' labor, because there is labor by the capitalists, right? It's labor to literally just employ someone. There is some labor there. I mean, even if it's just mental labor, you have to hire the person, you have to do the thing. I mean, there is work, right? But that's what I mean. So you believe that 100% of it is created by the workers' labor.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with words like labor is that when you start talking in economics, you're not talking in everyday talk. So these are terms of art. They're not. Right. So labor, when in a Marxist analysis, isn't just any time you work. That's not all labor fits into the capitalist scheme. When you go home and you plant your garden and you work all day on it and you grow crops, right. If you're not doing that to exchange in the market, then you're not really working.
So if you eliminate the capitalist, right, and you have the workers own and operate their business, whatever it is, their enterprise that they're working in, then they will receive all 100% of the economic value that they created.
No, I don't think they will. No, not if they're exchanging, not if they're still producing commodities for exchange in the market. What they'll do is they'll divvy up, they'll give themselves wages and they'll reinvest. They might get a little more, but they'll reinvest. A lot of it's just going to be reinvested in capital. So why is that better? It's not necessarily. I'm not into co-ops. That's not any kind of solution for capitalism. You could have a capitalist society that was all run by workers' co-ops. It wouldn't be optimal, but you can become your own capitalist. The problem is what we're producing and how, and not who is doing it.
You mean what we're producing is a problem for you? Like the particular commodities, or
no, the fact that they're commodities. The fact that they're commodities that we're producing exclusively for exchange and service of an abstract value. That's the problem, and not who's doing it.
Why is the exchange of things a problem?
It's not. It's the fact that we're producing for exchange in an effort to produce a surplus of this abstract value, as
opposed to producing for direct use.
As opposed for producing for use. Right. I mean. But that, look, that's not enough to say, production for use just leaves so much off the table. Like, we need a new mode of production, not some catchphrase, because I don't know what that means. Production for use. Whose use? There's a state going to decide that? What are you talking about? I mean, so we need a new mode of production, and that's what we don't. Communists and socialists and Marxists don't really have a good theory on that. The best we've got are things like Paracon, which I don't love. But in my book, Bash Revolution, which is a dystopia. I mean, I'm not saying that the answer is like right in front of us on this. I just can tell you what the problem is. Like, I know what's wrong with the game we're playing. We need a new game. We don't have one yet.
Right. So let's talk about the working class for a second here. By and large, the working class in advanced capitalist countries would think what you're saying is total witchcraft. It just wouldn't make any sense to them. It'd be like you were speaking Albanian to them. They would They would have no idea what you're talking about. I have
some people who watch my little videos and buy our books.
I'm not. No. Hold on. So the Frankfurt School comes along and explains the fact that the vast majority of the working class in these countries have these ideas that capitalism are good, or at least that they don't have any negative ideas about capitalism. They have no interest in overthrowing the boss and taking over the factory, or in establishing a socialist economy, or any of the stuff that you're talking about either. They explain it as false consciousness, one of the most totalitarian terms and concepts ever invented by anybody. And we need to be taking that Frankfurt School to task every single day, out to the woodshed on that very thing. I heard you employ the term earlier in this conversation.
Yeah, and I hated that term for years, and it's only after reading Lukács that I would dare to use it, because it doesn't quite mean what everyone thinks it means when they use it. It's not like people are stupid. It's that people aren't able to enact their ideas. So
that we can put that aside. But what you're doing is something different, I think, which it's sort of false consciousness, but it's actually very clear and empirical and rational in a good way, which is that I think you're saying that there is simply the working class will benefit materially and maybe in other ways, but at least materially, right? If they do away with the capitalists, if they do away with capitalism, they will receive more value from their labor.
So, I wouldn't say that because, again, it's like, here's my problem. I think I can tell you why capitalism works the way it does and why things aren't working well and why we're riven with crisis and problems.
Yeah, that also, I don't understand that. Like, where do you see that? That's a very strange look. That's a very strange view of the world. I simply do not see it.
Okay. Why do I think that why I can explain that? I can explain it to some good degree, like I can say, look, the problem is that the way, I'd have to go into the weeds to really explain this now, but I can say, for instance, over time, capital accumulates. In other words, one or two major players are going to become dominant. They're going to put other players out of business. And this happens for reasons that aren't down to their ambition. That it's just that's the nature of capitalism. So I can say that. I can say, and that will lead to a crisis in profitability for that monopoly company as they become better and better at producing the goods. So they're going to seek to remedy that. There are different ways to do it. They're going to try to suppress wages, or they're going to try to find whole markets for labor.
Or God forbid, make a better product, which is what they usually try to do, right? Because they're not stupid.
Product, if it's making a better product, if it's efficient, in other words, okay, what does that even mean? Making a better product? You mean like it does the job better, so they put more of their competition out of business and are responsible for producing more of it than they were before? Because the problem is not. The reason the value of the individual commodity goes down over time is not because it's not a good product. It's because of the speed in which it can be produced, the efficiency in which it can be produced. And that has to come along with a monopoly because you're covering more of the territory. So you have to increase the mass production and be more and more efficient at producing the good just to meet the market demand. So that will mean that you're driving down the individual worth of each commodity because the commodity's value is based on the labor that went into producing it. So the labor time per commodity is going down. And so that's going to lead to a crisis of profitability. It's like purely mechanical thing. It's not anybody's.
But that all sounds good to me. That's what we want. We want the capitalists hustling to meet our demands.
Right. But then the rate of profit goes down. That means they can't reinvest, which means that they can't keep producing at the same rate. And so, which means that they have to do something if they're going to continue to expand, which is always their imperatives. Well, so then they're going to try to drive down wages, or they're going to try to open up new markets, or they might develop a whole new line of products which could be more profitable.
Well, they can't just first of all, they can't just drive down wages, right? They don't control the market for labor.
They don't control the market for labor, and there will be a countervailing force if this is just one company, right? I mean, they'll just go out of business is what will happen if they try that.
Yeah.
In a market that's where the labor market is strong. But the problem is it happens on a total scale. I mean, that's what happened in 2008 to some degree, is that it happens not just in one industry, but across industries. And so then you have a problem, for the whole economy. But look, the point is that I can describe all these ways that capitalism goes into crisis. Now, it's all hinges on a few core concepts, and if you reject those, you reject everything. But and sometimes when I get into the weeds, I have to rethink because it's complicated. But the point is that I can kind of predict some of these things. I have enough of a grasp of this theory to say, yeah, this makes sense. This is a logical outcome of the way we're doing things. Also, I can see that baseline inequality, a class of people without productive property, is always going to be essential to capitalism, which means that the power is going to be out of a lot of people's hands forever in this system. So, but I can't promise that, like, oh yeah, if you just get rid of this, everything will be better, because that's only half the equation. We have to come up with a new mode of production. And if we just destroy what is, that doesn't mean that we're going to have something there to take its place.
Okay, but it sounds like, just to pull this together, though, I mean, it sounds to me like you have two major complaints about capitalism. One is exploitation, what you call exploitation. The other is the production of what you call crises, right? Mm-hmm. The recurrent, inevitable production of crises.
Those are two I pointed to, but yeah.
That you believe, well, those are the ones you seem to talk about a lot. Yeah. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that's what.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, so back to the exploitation thing. So it seems to me like what you're saying is that what we need to do is show the working class that they are being exploited, and that you can do that. You can do that rationally. You can lay out the case rationally that they are being exploited, and that they will use their rational faculties to apprehend this truth about this system, right? You think you can do that. You can actually convince the working class that they are exploited in the way that you think they are.
Yeah, but I don't know if that's enough. I think what we have to do is develop a better idea of how to than this. And
I know, but that's where it starts, right? And so right there, I think that I would say, sure, it's possible. So I mean, people have convinced large numbers of workers to do all sorts of things, right? By telling them what their lives were, what the system they lived in was, how things really were, and they would use categories, not like sometimes exploitation, sometimes slavery, sometimes other categories they would apply to their oppression, they would apply to their lives, and then sometimes large numbers of people, working class people, poor people, whoever, would say, yeah, you know what, that does describe my life, and now give me the axe and the torch, and I'll go take down the man.
Well, I wouldn't want anyone to go fight the revolution based on understanding my critique of capitalism.
No, that's not my issue here. No, I'm getting to. I'm saying.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm saying that you, Doug Lain, could convince millions and millions of workers to see their lives the way that you do, to see exploitation the way that you see it. Okay. I also think it is just as likely that they won't see it that way, no matter how well you present the case. And this brings us back to Foucault, which is that to him, power comes from below, it comes from above, it circulates sideways, up and down, it goes in multiple directions. There is no external source. There's no single source. It doesn't go from top down or bottom up. It's just moves. It circulates is the word he uses. It circulates constantly everywhere. And he doesn't really explain, he doesn't even try to explain a cause of it. Why do people have particular ideas? What is at the base of the desire by capitalists to invest in these businesses and to become captains of industry and to become global leaders? He doesn't actually try to explain that. Weber sort of did, but I actually side with Foucault on that. He just sort of punts. He doesn't know. He just sees that this is what we have. We just see that people have particular desires and particular interpretations of texts, which may or may not have anything to do with rationality and the use of reason and their human faculties. It could just be they just think God exists and Jesus was his son and the guy walked on whatever it is, or that there's exploitation under capitalism the way that Doug Lain sees it, right? It could be completely superstitious. It could be totally rational. But anyway, my point is that working class people are like people in that they have been, at least so far, infinitely subjective, that they have seen the world in infinite ways. Always. There has never been a moment where they were just exposed to one interpretation and vast swaths of the whole world's population just went in that direction and said, yes, that's how I see this, right? For moments and in particular places, at particular times, that's happened for some people. But even there, I mean, even if you look at like Maoist China, like how much of the working class in China at the time totally agreed with Mao's interpretation of the world and capitalism and all the rest.
All of them did. No.
Right, well,
they were shot.
Well, in fact, Maoism sort of proved that most didn't, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't have had to torture them and parade them through the streets and go through this ritual humiliation all the time, right?
Here's what this is my romantic notion. I'm a romantic rationalist, okay? So I admit this. My romantic notion is this: is that if we work on it, if people who are really concerned work on it, what we can do, what we can present to the working classes of the world is a problem. Not any answers, not a solution, but a problem. That the more people get involved in trying to solve it, the more likely we'll be able to come up with something new and better. That's
what
it.
I'm saying.
I'm not saying is we should go storm the streets right now and take political power tomorrow, because if we did, we wouldn't know what to do with it. We have to work on this problem. So all I can present is a problem. That's it.
But my point is that most working class people don't see it as a problem. They don't see the problems. They don't see these problems.
I don't think that's true. They just have different answers. And because look, we started this conversation with talking about the alt-right and not the alt-right, the anti-social justice warrior industry, and how the working class are attracted to it. And you can look around the world and see people all around the world, even in relative affluence, miserable and destructive.
Well,
and no, it is happening. Now,
okay.
You can also look around the world and see on a day-to-day level, people are having just fine time. But there are these trends towards dissatisfaction and alienation. And,
well, that's a claim that's highly contentious, right? I mean, it's hard to prove that, No. I mean, I know people have tried, but I am highly skeptical of that. You can measure happiness.
I'm not talking about happiness only. I'm just talking about a sense of dissatisfaction and feeling of being dislocated, and a feeling of not being respected sometimes, and so often, so in large parts of the world, a feeling of real precarity and struggle for just everyday things like shoes, but also and food in some parts of the world. But more often than not, in the first world, there is just a struggle to feel like you're contributing to the world and you have a place in it, and that you're not just, anonymous and worthless. And I think that that's what these young men who are attracted to the anti-social justice warrior industry are looking for, is a way for them to be important again and to have some role in their own lives. And I think tackling the problem of how to create a better society based on a different economy is a much better answer than, blaming some blue-haired college students or feminism or, transsexual people for your problems.
You know what I have found is almost universal among these anti-SJW people who listen to podcasts like Rogan's and mine? A love of science, a belief in rationality and reason and logic.
Which is why I think I have a fighting chance.
Yeah. Right. So, and that's one of the things I'm scared of with them. But, and this is one of the reasons a lot of them hate my guts, because they've heard me do my Foucault stuff on Rogan, and that really drove them crazy, which I find interesting how that is the most controversial thing I've ever said, that gender is a social construct. That's the thing that really set people off. I have made arguments that are so controversial, it'll make your head spin about all kinds of stuff. That's the one that got me death threats. And still to this day, every single day, I get some guy on Twitter or Facebook will tell me that I'm a fucking idiot for saying that, and what a jackass, and boy, you're the stupidest person. Are you sure you're a professor? Every day. This was a year ago I said that on Rogan, and still every day they come in and need to tell me how stupid I am for that.
Gender, what I would say to Rogan if I were on the set, look, gender is a cultural approach to dealing with the problem of sex.
Well, Right there. Already, I disagree with you. I mean, so sex as a category is problematic to me. But anyway, yeah, I mean,
right. But that's
a social construct as well. Yeah.
Right, well, okay. But I mean, we are biological beings and we do have sex differences. I mean,
no, I mean, those are yes, but those are social constructs. So those are socially.
No, every time you have a conception of it, every time you have a description of it, and every time you try to pin it down, all you're doing is interpreting a problem. You're not actually coming to a final. Look, I'm not saying that we know what sex is precisely. I'm just saying that we have noticed a problem in the world, and it's called sex. And the gender are all the various ways that different societies have tried to deal with them.
So what Foucault says is that we created the problem of sex, and he can show you. He can show you. That's what he does. He's a historian, and this is his brilliant methodology. Basically, all of his work is just historical. All he does is he says, okay, right now we're talking about X, whatever it is. We're talking about transgenderism, we're talking about lesbianism, we're talking about gay, whatever the thing is, okay, which we all believe is this natural, immutable truth, okay? Well, here's the history of it. And he just goes back and looks and shows you, okay, back in 1827, this psychiatrist said that blank about women, right? And then it became this idea about women and that idea about women, and now we have it to this idea about women being this way, and this is just true. Well, it turns out we've only thought that for a little while. It has a history, meaning it started with human beings. It's historically contingent.
So are you saying that there was no conception of sex before, like, say, agriculture?
There were, so the category of sex as we think of it did not exist until the 19th century.
Sure. Okay. But
what do you mean? You're talking about
our category of sex is informed by how we approach gender. Okay. So how we formulate even the problem is informed by our practices and our conceptions of what the problem is. But what I'm asking is, can we find anything before, say, agriculture, where people were divided in two along lines that had to do with their genitalia? Or was that something that came about only after agriculture? And it's a sincere question. I tend to think not, but I don't know.
Pre-agriculture, I don't know. I mean, I know a tiny bit, but not directly. I haven't studied that. But my feeling and the anecdotal evidence I know about is simply that it was different. The way that gender, of course, they didn't use that term, but like the way that gender was conceived, the way that it was used, the way that it was employed, it was just simply different and fluid, right? And changing. And this is another of Foucault's major points, is that if you look at history, you'll see that all these ideas change constantly. Ideas about race, about gender, about sex, about everything change, about the natural world, the physical world, about truth and reality change constantly. So 1 minute, right, we're all convinced totally that the sun revolves around the earth. And then the next minute, we're all totally convinced that that's the stupidest thing in the whole wide world.
Right. So here's what I would say. Sex is like the fact that there are stars and suns and moons in the sky. Gender are all our different ways of trying to figure out what that is and what it means. But there's this first problem where we notice, hey, there's a ball of light in the sky. What is that?
Well, no, because the ball of light before it was a sun was the reflection from light from the earth that was reflecting off of a glass dome that covered the world. Even the earth wasn't a concept yet. So there was no sun then. It was this other thing entirely. There wasn't, for most people who thought about it, as far as we know.
They had the experience of light above them,
right? Well, okay, so you could say that there's sensory perceptions, right? Things come in through our eyeballs and then hit our brain. And then the question is, what does the brain do with that, right? The interpretation. Yeah.
I agree with you. You can't ever really separate the interpretation from the bare facts. There are no bare facts. There are only interpretations. Yeah. I agree with that. But the point is that in everyday talk, it's important to understand, if you want to change things, I think the distinction between what we think of as sex and what we think of as gender is an important one, because no one is making the claim really that, what we think of as a man in biological terms could have a kid, that there are, that could get pregnant, say. That is a seeming fact on a different level than the fact that women should work in a kitchen. We can see, like, oh yeah, these expectations, these gender expectations, these social roles are one thing. The fact that we, when we reproduce, one sex is one that gets a fetus in its womb is another. That doesn't mean we have to solve that problem or deal with that difference in this way.
So this is the circular logic or closed logical system of rational humanism that I was talking about. So here's what we do. We say a man is someone who cannot have a child, and therefore a man cannot have a child.
Right. Okay. Right.
So we define, we say, that is a rock. Therefore, that thing right there, that's a rock.
I think the way to
or you say a rock is that thing, right? That's what they do. And so Sam Harris, I love this. I tweeted it and he tried to respond to me actually on Twitter. He said in a recent podcast, reason maps onto reality. That's what reason is.
No. Reason, I would say, reason is our approach, is our attempts to grapple with our experience in a coherent way and through a self-reflection. But
yeah, it's all tautological, though, is my point. So we define men as not people who don't have children, and so that when we see a person who doesn't have children, we say that's a man or can't have children. That's a man. It's tautological.
Look, you can't. Right. Okay, I understand what we'd have to get into the weeds on Derrida and on language and on reason and all of that. And so here's the thing: the reason why I think it's a good idea to make the distinction between sex and gender when you're talking in regular everyday talk is because when you say that you don't see the difference between sex and gender, you just sound like you're loony to most people, because most people think, at the very least, I know what a woman gives, has breasts or should maybe has breasts and definitely has a womb and uterus and these are, look, what about hermaphrodites? These are not absolutes in the world. The truth is, the human race could change, and we could start in 20 years. We could all say, let's do away with sexual reproduction and start cloning ourselves. So, But okay, so nothing is absolutely fixed.
So
I still want to say, it's important to say, look, when we talk about gender being a social construct, what we mean primarily, what's most important about that socially and politically, is that the kinds of expectations socially and politically, in terms of what kinds of jobs women can do or men can do, in terms of what kinds of people they are, and what kinds of clothes they should wear. All of that isn't natural fact. That's how we have adopted the ways we've tried to deal with the fact that there are differences between that. We can at least say difference is real, and where we want to place it is maybe a choice. But there are differences, and these are how we are trying to deal with them. We could do it better. We could do something differently, and maybe our gender roles would be more interesting in a different approach.
So that's very strange to me. So I've heard people do this, and I've actually heard Charles Murray do this recently about race. He goes to great pains to demonstrate, to show, to prove that Black people have lower IQs than white people on average. Yeah. Okay. It's just a biological fact. Can't deny it. He actually has the numbers. I forget what it is, but there's some some difference, numerical difference in the average IQ scores of blacks and whites, according to him. Of course, he's never asked who is black and who is white. But anyway, that's a different story. But then this is the thing that amazes me. Then he goes on to say, well, of course, I would never, ever suggest that we organize our society in any way that takes account of that. Right. And so it's so hold on. I mean, if I'm an employer, right, and I agree with you that there is a biological difference in IQ among blacks and whites, then hell yeah, I'm going to discriminate against black people when they come apply for a job here. Of course. What kind of idiot do you think I am? So it's like this. It's this contradiction, right? And so it sounded maybe like you were doing that with gender there. So you say,
I didn't say that. I said that first of all, I don't think race is the same kind of category as sex. Okay, race is totally construct, through and through, as far as I'm concerned. But so that's number one. Number two, I'm not saying that we can reach a lot of conclusions about what we know about women or men based on what we know for sure about sexual difference, or what we think we know for sure about sexual difference, which, by the way, are themselves things that are open to revision because, things, even biology changes, right? And we could make changes. I mean, to get really dark. But no, I mean, what I'm saying is that if you want to make social change, you don't make social change by trying to paper over problems or differences, or like the fact, like for instance, the wage gap. The reason the wage gap exists is because women often take time out to go have kids.
Yeah, that's
the primary reason why it exists. Now, you want to get rid of the wage gap, you got to do something about that. Now, there are things to do. For instance, you could provide more maternity leave. You could provide more daycare. You could also set up a system where, that's built in, like by law, that's the fact that women do that is no longer going to be a barrier to promotion, that there's a different standard based on that difference. All of those things could be things that are implemented to eliminate the wage gap. Whether or not they're recommended, I don't know. But the point is, if you just say the wage gap is not fair and then ignore the fact that it's happening primarily, not exclusively, because of women leaving to go have kids, then you're going to just have a permanent problem. And then you have to ask yourself, well, why do I like having that permanent problem? What is that permanent problem doing for me?
So let me present to you the Foucauldian, Russellian take on the wage gap issue. And then I just want to hear if this is not sufficient for you. Okay. So I think Foucault would say this, and this is certainly what I would say. The wage gap as we see it, that number, that difference in wages between the people we define as men and women, is a fact as we define these facts. The question then, and I think that the wage gap as we define it is produced mostly by women's choices, as you're saying. I agree with you. I agree with that politics. Okay. I think that's true. I think it's actually been borne out by the evidence. So then the question is, right, what causes women to have these different preferences, to value private life, to value being a mother over being a worker or a CEO? Why is that more common among women, the people we define as women, than the people we define as men? And so I would say, good luck proving that it's biological, that comes from their biology.
Oh, I don't think it's biological. I think it's biological that they take the time off because they're the ones who are giving birth. But that doesn't,
that's a biological, that's an essentialist claim.
Yeah.
That's an essentialist claim.
Right. But I have 4 kids. I know which one of us went through the pain of childbirth, and it wasn't me. And that just in so much as like you give birth, and maybe if you're a hippie, you breastfeed. You don't have to. But it takes some time to recover. So I guess the thing that I'm claiming here is that it's more likely for the woman to want to stay with that baby after she gave birth to it than
after this creature caused the most incredible pain in her life, ripped her in half. She's gonna naturally want to stay with that kid more than the guy who experienced no physical pain from it.
Right. No, you're right.
I don't think so, man.
I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Okay. I'm not saying that the fact that she's the one who stays home with the kid is a natural fact. Okay. I don't mean to claim that. But I will say that gender is the reason why that's happening. That we've come up with an approach to dealing with the fact of sexual difference, the fact that the woman gives birth, that includes that becomes a woman's responsibility for quite a long time to raise that kid. And that's not a natural fact.
That's cultural.
That's cultural. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
So another. So I'm not Foucauldian because I still think that that the gender, but you have to remember the gender approaches are always ways to dealing with natural or material problems. Not natural, but material problems, because even the material problems are informed by our previous decisions. But yeah, so, I think that you would have a hard time convincing a lot of mothers today that they should not stay home with their kid for, very long and go right back to work. And I'm not even sure that's what a really just society would do. But I do think that it's a cultural phenomenon.
Okay.
And I don't think that men are naturally more inclined to go back to work than women. Or I would need a lot of evidence to demonstrate that could be what we call hormonal or, genetic or something like that. But anyway, yeah, we've been talking a long time. The one thing I've learned is that you're a very good conversationalist. In other words, we disagree enough that it keeps the conversation exciting.
Oh, good.
So we should do it some more if you weren't too frustrated with me.
Oh, never. No, I was going to say that I what I hear coming from you is a postmodernist Foucauldian just emerging. You're giving birth. There's coming out of you. Like it's just it's seeping out, and like you're struggling to keep that thing contained, but it's inevitable. It's the march of history, Doug. You're going to be by the end of our next conversation, because I'm the vanguard. I'm the vanguard here of history, of historical progress, and I'm gonna lead the revolution within you, and you're going to become a full-fledged member of the postmodernist Foucauldian relativist society.